This is a Chase Bliss Thermae pedal. It's an analog delay pedal with a lot of extra stuff going on. I acquired one of these recently in kind of an interesting set of circumstances, which I will go into here in a minute. I've been thinking a lot about this pedal in the context of my job in software, where I use a sense-making framework called Cynefin to help think through complex and/or complicated problems. I think the Thermae pedal does a really good job of illustrating how that framework works, and correspondingly, I think the Cynefin framework does a really good job of helping me get the best out of this potentially complex musical device. So later in this video, we're going to explain how to use that framework and this pedal together so that each of them can help us understand the other, and hopefully by the end we will have learned a thing or two about both. But first, what is a Thermae pedal exactly? Thermae is a bucket Brigade Delay pedal. Bucket Brigade Delay devices were the first type of analog delay devices ever not to use tape. Here's a simplified explanation of how they work. They are a kind of integrated circuit component that contains a long row of tiny capacitors called registers alongside a timing circuit. When an audio signal hits the front of the Bucket Brigade chip, the first capacitor in the chip samples the voltage. Then the timing circuit tells it to pass that voltage along to the next capacitor according to a clock interval. That frees up the first capacitor to sample the next voltage. This goes on until the sampled voltages hit the end of the row of capacitors, at which point the audio voltage goes out into the wet side of the circuit, and there is your delayed audio signal. The sampled voltages are passed along like firefighters passing water along in buckets, thus the term Bucket Brigade Delay. Now, if you're at all familiar with how digital audio works, you might be saying to yourself, so it's an analog sample buffer? And the answer is basically yes. The capacitors are essentially working in the same way that integers work in digital sample buffers, and they are subject to the same limitations, namely the Nyquist Theorem, which states that in order to avoid aliasing, you need to have a sample rate that is at least twice the frequency of the highest frequency sound that you're sampling. If you're not familiar with digital audio, that probably sounded like a bunch of gobbledygook. It will become important later on when we try to understand why Thermae makes certain types of sounds, and we can take comfort in knowing that we don't have to understand the math to use the pedal. The math just explains why it sounds like it does when we set it certain ways. For now, let's just keep in mind how Bucket Brigade pedals work, and that a Thermae pedal contains 4 MN3005 Bucket Brigade chips, each containing 4,096 stages of registers, and that by laying those chips back to back, it would theoretically be able to hold 0.8192 seconds of high-fidelity audio in its capacitors. In reality, electrical capacitors aren't perfectly good at holding on to these voltages, and there are a few different complementary strategies employed to make the system sound good, including low-pass filtering and companding the signal. The result of those strategies is what gives Bucket Brigade pedals their characteristic sound. If the Chase Bliss Thermae pedal were just a regular analog delay pedal, that would be the end of the story. However, Thermae is not just a regular analog delay pedal, and the reason lies in its timing circuit. Remember that there's a timing circuit telling the row of capacitors how fast to pass along the audio voltage. What sets Thermae apart is that it treats that timing circuit itself as if it were a voltage-controlled oscillator in a synthesizer. The pedal lets you change how fast the capacitors are passing that voltage around, and if the capacitors are holding on to audio voltage when the speed changes, that creates a very characteristic kind of pitch-shifting sound. That's why Chase Bliss Audio describes it as an analog pitch shifter. Thermae has a bunch of ways in which you can play around with that timing circuit, and we're going to demonstrate those later in the video as we seek to make sense of them and how to control them. For now, I just wanted to explain what the pedal basically is so you have some idea of why it's cool and why I wanted one. So now, I wanted to go briefly into the context of how I ended up purchasing one of these pedals. For all the reasons above, this was sort of a bucket list pedal for me, but I had been waiting to purchase one because they're a little on the expensive side. However, two things happened in 2024 that caused me to pull the trigger immediately. The first was an announcement that Chase Bliss made on August 22nd. It came to the company's attention that the photoresistor technology that they use to control their pedals has been banned by the European Union. The way that these photoresistors work is, there's a circuit that changes its resistance based on how light or dark its environment is, and thus you can easily change the resistance of that circuit by putting an LED next to it inside a light, tight container. This light resistance circuit plus LED configuration is called a Vactrol, and it was a standard synthesizer part in a lot of vintage gear. The problem is, the magic chemical that makes that resistance change possible is cadmium sulfide, which is a carcinogen and is now illegal to sell electronic products that contain it in Europe in more than trace amounts. Chase Bliss decided to discontinue all of their products that contain cadmium Vactrols and extended their warranty to forever so that people don't throw them away, in the spirit of keeping cadmium out of the groundwater. That meant discontinuing Preamp Mark II, Warped Vinyl Hi-Fi, Dark World, Condor Hi-Fi, and the Thermae pedal. They had an existing stock of these pedals, and they were planning on selling them on a special website called Chase Bliss Legacy that only sells in the United States, where we routinely don't care about putting horrific chemicals into our bodies. So I was sad about that, but I still didn't buy my Thermae right away. I just didn't get around to it right away. That changed when Chase Bliss announced the mystery box promotion. If you are involved in any of Chase Bliss's social media groups, then you know all about this mystery box promotion. If you're not, here's a quick summation. On November 21st, 2024, Chase Bliss sent out an email saying they were doing a holiday sale with a nice discount and free shipping, and they were also selling these things called mystery boxes that cost $300, and inside them you got a random Chase Bliss pedal, including the legacy pedals. All of their pedals cost more than $300, so it was a good deal no matter what, but then they sweetened it further by stating that some amount of the boxes will also contain additional pedals from other indie pedal manufacturers, some will contain rare limited edition pedals, and 5 of them will have Willy Wonka-esque golden tickets that get you every Chase Bliss pedal for life. At that moment, I realized that A, I needed in on this mystery box promotion, and B, every Thermae they had remaining in stock was definitely going into a mystery box, so if I wanted to buy one, time was running out. So I purchased a mystery box and a Thermae as well. Okay, fast forward to November 26th. Chase Bliss are shipping regular orders out at a higher priority than mystery boxes, so my Thermae pedal arrives after a couple of days. I plug it in right away, plug a synthesizer into it, and am instantaneously confused. Not disappointed, confused. Everything that the pedal is doing sounds great, but I don't understand the relationship between what goes into the input and what comes out of the output, like, at all. Chase Bliss always has these gorgeous little manuals, and this one is no different. The manual is this beautiful little design object, which instructs you to start out by setting the pedal up like so. Doing so turns this into this. Which is a fascinating sound, but what is it? The manual is making some claims about how it forces the timing shift to only shift by musical intervals, but I'm looking at this pedal and I don't understand how the notes that go in turn into the notes that are coming out. What's more, the markings on the pedal seem to indicate that this introductory setting should raise my sequence by a fifth, but it's definitely doing something other than that. For one thing, it's also pitch shifting a bunch of things downward. There's clearly a lot going on here that I don't understand. That was about a month ago. I have spent a lot of my free time in the past month down in my basement in the Church of the Thermae pedal, and I have come to the conclusion that a Thermae pedal is a complex musical object that gives you the means to control its own complexity. You can control that complexity to the point where it goes from complex to complicated all the way back to simple if you want. Now, what do I mean by complex versus complicated versus simple? That's where Cynefin comes in. Cynefin is a framework designed by a guy named Dave Snowden who works in the software business. The word Cynefin is the Welsh word for habitat, but it's a bit more nuanced in that it includes in habitat all the history and inputs, known and unknown, that have led to the current state of that habitat or community. The framework is a way of making sense out of systems by trying to understand how ordered they are. The framework has a diagram that looks like this. On the bottom right, we have simple, top right is complicated, top left is complex, and bottom left is chaotic. In the middle is disorder or confusion. This image is from a video that I will link below where Mr. Snowden does a nice job of explaining how the framework works, but I'll try to summarize it here. On the right side of the diagram are what we can describe as ordered systems. Ordered systems are predictable. Given a particular input, you can expect that you will reliably get another predictable output. On the bottom right are simple systems, which are rules-based systems which can be understood by any reasonable person. If you understand what the system is, then you can apply the generally accepted rules about a system like that and go on about your day. A door with a key locking mechanism is a simple system. If the door is locked, you can lock it with the key and then it won't open. If it's locked, you can unlock it with the key and then it will open. If you don't have a key, you can't lock it or unlock it. Everybody knows this about keys and doors. Thus, those are examples of simple systems. A queuing system at a restaurant is another example of a simple system. When you walk into a restaurant, you might see that the way the queue works is that you get in a line behind other people. Or you may have to put in your name with the host and then sit down until they call you. In either case, when you know what the rule is, you know what it is that you need to do. Complicated systems are like simple systems in that they have predictable inputs and outputs. The difference is that it requires expertise to understand a complicated system and how it works. Knowing the right thing to do requires an expert to understand what's happening. If you have a headache, a simple thing to try is to take an anti-inflammatory drug like an ibuprofen or whatever. However, if you have a headache that persists for more than 3 days, the ibuprofen bottle says to call a doctor. And the reason is that a headache that lasts that long indicates a complicated health problem and you need an expert, in this case a doctor, to analyze and understand that problem before choosing the right plan of action. An example in music might be the following question. If I play a G minor chord, followed by a C7 chord, what chord do I play after that? An oversimplified answer is that the correct answer is F major. A more correct answer is, I don't know, it depends. What else is going on in the song? If you find yourself saying that the answer to a question is it depends and that context matters, you are dealing with a complicated system. Complex systems are systems where supplying a known input does not result in a reliable output. In fact, in a complex system, supplying any input may modify the system such that the rules of the system itself may change. The only way to deduce the behavior of the system is through experimentation. Relationships are complex systems. Organizations are complex systems. Marketplaces are complex systems. The way to interact with a complex system is for an expert to design experiments that are quote-unquote safe to fail and use the results of those experiments to deduce the next course of action. Probe, sense, respond, as Dave Snowden would have put it. Chaotic systems are systems where there are no discernible constraints and no detectable relationship between cause and effect. The move here is to do something, anything, in the hope that some type of repeatable order can be discerned, at which point the system can be treated as complex. Disorder/confusion occurs when you don't know what kind of system you're looking at. Which brings us finally back to the Chase Bliss Thermae pedal, which I just realized I have not yet really described. The front panel has 6 knobs, 4 toggle switches, and 2 foot switches. The bottom toggle switch just lets you store and retrieve presets. We're going to ignore that one. The top 3 knobs are very straightforward. Mix, which sets the mix between dry and wet signal. LPF, which is a resonant low-pass filter. And regen, which is another word for feedback or repeats. It takes some of the delayed signal and routes it back to the front of the bucket Brigade. The next row of knobs are where things get weird. The first knob is glide, which we're going to skip that for now, leave that at 0. The next 2 are int1 and int2, which are sequencer steps. These 2 knobs are where you decide whether you want this system to be simple or complex. If these 2 knobs are at noon, this is a delay pedal. It sounds like this. Let's try turning one of these knobs to the right a little bit. That's cool, I guess. What is it doing, though? How about let's turn it to the left a little bit? It kind of sounds the same, maybe a little woolier. One thing that it is certainly not doing is pitch shifting up the echoes by the amount shown on the knob. It might be doing that, but it's also definitely doing something else. Here's what it's doing. Inside a Thermae pedal is a little digital sequencer. You set the speed of that sequencer by setting the tempo of the delay, which you set by tapping the tempo on the left foot switch. If the interval knobs are at noon, then the sequencer does nothing. If they are set to an interval, then that sets a sequencer step. When the sequencer hits that step, it changes the timing circuit for the bucket Brigade by that interval so that the voltages are passed along at a different speed. This causes the pitch to shift and also causes the delay time to change. The sequencer repeats forever. This means that after the sequencer step is over, it goes back to the beginning. That means that the timing circuit gets told to go back to the original speed. That means that if there's anything in the bucket Brigade buffer when the sequencer loops around, the pitch will be snapped back in the opposite direction. That's why if you keep on playing while the sequencer is on an up step, the notes you play will be pitch shifted down when the timing circuit snaps back to what the manual calls the bass step. If you introduce a third step by turning the second knob, the timing circuit will move according to that step after the first one, so the bucket Brigade will jump in speed to whatever that knob is set to, and then after that it will snap back to the original speed, the bass step. Setting both of these knobs away from noon immediately creates a complex texture consisting of notes that you did not play in polyrhythms that don't have an obvious relationship to the rhythm that you played. The sequencer runs on its own forever, so it's not obvious what step you're even on when you're playing notes into the pedal. This is a complex system. So, knowing that, how can we apply what we learned about systems complexity from the Cynefin framework? We have 2 options. The first option is that we can deal with the complex system as it is, as a complex system. As the Cynefin framework suggests, the best way to address a complex system is to conduct experiments that are safe to fail. Probe, sense, respond. We cannot expect to get a complex system to do what we want. What we can do is try stuff until we start to understand any underlying principles and then expand upon those. The answer to how do I force this complex system to do my bidding is that you don't. The pedal enables you to design a complex system that you don't understand, and then you can explore the rules of that system if you want. That's the first option. The second option is that you can reduce the complexity of the system until it's in the complicated domain or the simple domain. The Thermae pedal has options that make either of those totally possible. If you just want your Thermae to act like a really great sounding delay pedal, here's what you do. Set both interval knobs to noon, and then turn on the dip switch labeled modulation. This changes the function of the interval knobs. They are now connected to a low-frequency oscillator that slowly changes the speed of the timing circuit just a little bit. This just adds a vibrato to the delay, the speed and depth of which is controlled by the knobs. A delay pedal is a simple system. You play a sound in, echoes come out. You can change the speed of the echoes and how long they repeat, set the mix amount, set the regeneration, set the low pass filter. All of this stuff is going to behave just like you expect, and it sounds awesome. There are basically two dimensions across which Thermae is complex, harmonic and rhythmic. I'm going to describe ways to take each of those dimensions out of the complex domain into the complicated domain. So let's use our musical expertise to get this pedal into a zone that is complicated rather than complex. Here's two ways. The simpler of the two is to select knob positions that don't have harmonic surprises in them. Recall that one of the problems that arise when setting intervals in the sequencer is that it shifts the pitch to notes you did not play, and those new notes might not be notes that work in the music that you're playing. That happens because if you select an interval of a fourth or a fifth, the pitch shift will be up by that amount, and when it snaps back, that will be the reverse of that interval. If one of the knobs is set to a fourth or a fifth, it's starting to get complex depending on what you're playing. If you select a fourth or a fifth for both knobs, you're in an irreducibly complex harmonic space. If you set both knobs to either none, octave, minus octave, 2 octave, or minus 2 octave, then the only notes that will come out will be octave shifts of the notes that you played. No surprises. A helpful side effect of doing this is that the rhythmic relationship of the echoes will also always be somewhat on grid because the repeats will either be 2x or 4x speed or the inverse. The second way to reduce harmonic complexity is to utilize our music theory knowledge such that we can use a pitch shift of a fifth or a fourth without the shifted notes going out of key. If you do know some basic music theory, then this part will make sense. If not, well, you can either just trust me or don't try this. Now, if we think about how the pitch shifts work, if you choose to let it pitch shift up by a fifth, when it snaps back, it will go down by a fifth. So for example, if you were playing a C, it will jump up to a G, and if you keep playing a C so that the bucket brigade still has a C in it, when it snaps back, it will pitch shift it down a fifth to an F. It's very similar if you're using a fourth. The pitch shift up from a C takes it to an F, and if you keep giving the bucket brigade a C, when it snaps back, it will become a G. That means that any note you play while using an interval of a fourth or a fifth is going to result in a pitch collection that looks like this: the original note plus the notes a fourth and a fifth above it. So if you want to be safe and only end up with notes in key, you have to stick to notes for which the fourth and fifth above it are in key. In major, that means that we have to leave out the fourth scale degree, because a fourth above that would be a flat seventh, which is out of key. And we have to leave out the seventh because a fifth above that would be a flat five, which is also out of key. Leaving out the fourth and seventh scale degree just happens to be the same thing as keeping in 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, which is a major pentatonic scale. That collection of notes also happens to be the minor pentatonic scale, which is the same collection of notes, it just starts in a different place. So, if one of your intervals is a fourth or a fifth, and the other is either nothing or one of the octaves, then you can play any note in either pentatonic scale, and the pedal will transpose it only to notes that are in key. The free-running sequencer clock is the most untamable feature that makes it pretty uncooperative in terms of reducing complexity. That free-running sequencer clock, though, can be disconnected. In order to do that, just flip the step dip switch. Flipping the step dip switch disconnects the sequencer from the clock and connects it instead to the tap foot switch. This makes the Thermae pedal act like a regular old analog delay pedal with a special feature in that you can tap the tap foot switch and make it pitch shift by a preset interval, and then tap it again to make it snap back. This makes it surprisingly straightforward to make useful pitch shifts in your music. You can play whatever you want for as long as you want and enjoy the sound of that analog delay, and then when you want to fire off a pitch shift, you can purposely load up the Bucket Brigade buffer with notes that will sound good after that pitch shift. This makes it much easier to plan musical phrases that take advantage of the pitch shifter, and that is basically Thermae on easy mode. It takes away the characteristic bath bubbles texture that you get from the sequencer, but in return you get a pedal that does what you want, when you want. Let's now take a look at the glide knob. The glide knob slows down how fast the sequencer jumps from step value to step value. It basically works like a portamento knob on a synthesizer. When you are in step mode, setting a long value on the glide knob can create a wonderful shoegazy slide between intervals. If you like the sound of the clock sequence Thermae bubbles, but the unpredictability of the free-running sequencer clock is driving you crazy, it really works great if you hook it up to a MIDI clock. I'm not going to describe in this video how to do that exactly because I think using MIDI with pedals is an opportunity for a whole other set of videos, and this one is already getting long. So for now, I'll just say how Thermae behaves when it gets MIDI clock. The tempo of the bass clock immediately locks in with the project tempo of your session as quarter notes or whatever you set the leftmost timing switch at, and then the sequencer follows the beat just like you'd expect. It works great. The three little switches underneath the sequencer knobs each represent how long the internal sequencer clock will wait on each step before moving on to the next sequencer step. Each can be a quarter note, a dotted eighth, or an eighth note. If you're playing a song in 4/4, as most songs in the Western canon are, then you will want to set those three switches so that they add up to 2 beats. Having them add up to something else will lead to a sequence that repeats out of phase with the bars in your song. Now, that could be a wonderful thing, but to me, that puts you back into the embrace complexity and chase the bliss where it lives category rather than forcing it back into the complicated domain. Maybe if you're like a prog rock or a math rock person, you can keep track of a sequence that only hits the downbeat every 5 bars or whatever. I'm not that smart though. Maybe someday. Now, you might remember that there was a 4th zone on the Cynefin map, which is for chaotic systems. I think the closest analogy to a chaotic system in the Thermae pedal is something that you probably have encountered already, which is the pedal's tendency to run away into self-oscillation. Like any analog audio circuit, the capacitors in the Bucket Brigade chips can be overloaded. This can happen if the original signal is very loud, it can happen if the filter causes a resonant peak in the audio to be very loud, or it can just happen if the regen knob is cranked high enough that it makes the combination of what's in the Bucket Brigade buffer loud when combined with the feedback input. If the Bucket Brigade is feeding back, which is to say that the regen knob is turned up so that the output of the bucket brigade is being piped back into the input, and the chip gets overloaded, then the sound of that overload gets pushed back into the front of the chip, which leads immediately to what we call self-oscillation, which means that the chip will keep on feeding itself forever until you turn it down. This makes, as you have probably encountered, a very loud and raunchy noise. Depending on what you like, you might have been delighted. Cynefin's guidance for chaotic systems is to just respond to whatever happens and then get back to a less chaotic space. In the case of a Thermae pedal, that means you want to return out of the chaotic space by reducing the regeneration until the self-oscillation ends. Whether or not you stay in that chaotic space and for how long is what Dave Snowden would call an opportunity for innovation. Chase Bliss clearly thinks we want to spend some amount of time in that chaotic domain because they gave us a shortcut to it. No matter what's happening, you hold down the tap foot switch, that automatically causes the pedal to set the bucket brigade on fire and go into immediate self-oscillation. Then you can just let up on the foot switch and return to whichever of the other 3 domains you were exploring, possibly with singed eyebrows and smoke coming out of your ears. Something I mentioned earlier is the Nyquist Theorem and how its ramifications manifest in some of the sounds that come out of this pedal. The Nyquist Theorem states that an analog signal can be digitized without aliasing error if and only if the sampling rate is greater than or equal to twice the highest frequency component in a given signal. As we said earlier, the chips in the Thermae pedal have enough capacitors in them for 0.8192 seconds of high fidelity sound. However, the pedal allows you to delay signals much longer than that. It does this by setting the timing circuit such that it goes through the capacitors much too slowly to meet the requirements of the Nyquist theorem. There aren't enough capacitors per second to accurately hold the voltages, so there's audible stepping between the voltages. This is called aliasing, and it is something electronic musicians are very accustomed to hearing out of plugins like bit crushers that let you manually reduce a signal sample rate. What sounds like a digital bit crusher coming out of a Thermae pedal is actually an analog expression of this mathematical theorem. It's an all-analog signal path that still results in aliasing, which results in a very arcade-gamey sound that I personally really like. One final thought about the Chase Bliss Thermae is that I see a lot of people out there hoping for a Mark II version of the Thermae pedal that's in stereo. When I first was considering buying a Thermae, one consideration that was kind of hanging me up was that it's a mono pedal with no stereo output. However, in my opinion, it pairs wonderfully with the stereo digital delay pedal right after it in the signal chain. Here I'm using an Electro-Harmonic stereo memory man, but that's way more delay pedal than you need to get ping-pong delay happening after a Thermae. It has a ton of functions that I don't use. So if the lack of stereo is stopping you from pulling the trigger on a Thermae purchase, in my opinion, just stick a stereo digital delay after it. It sounds incredible in my opinion. I hope you found this video useful. I know that due to the mystery box promotion, there's at least a few new Thermae owners out there, and hey, you got to learn about Cynefin as a bonus. Have a great day, everybody.